Hi everybody, this is Joy at Pine Quilt Shop. Today we are going to talk about 5-yard quilts and picking fabric for them, as well as some great pattern options for 5-yard quilts. 5-yard quilts are a fun way to maybe pull some of the fabrics out of your stash. Maybe you came across the fabric you just fell in love with and you grabbed a yard or two of it and you're like, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that. But it's sometimes easy to take a beautiful focal print that caught your eye and find some additional pieces to go with it and to put a 5-yard quilt together. So 5-yard quilts are fun and easy to coordinate, and like I said, great ways to use up some of that fabric that might be in your stash. So I have in front of me a sample of a 5-yard quilt that we put together here in the shop, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we think are key to having a good 5-yard quilt kit. So the first thing that you really need to make sure you're getting is a mix of light, mediums, and darks. So we've got a light piece, one that's a little bit darker, a little bit darker, a little bit darker, and then a very dark piece. So you want to have that mix of light, medium, and dark fabrics. A great way to test that is to lay your fabrics out and switch your camera into black and white mode and take a picture of it and see, do you see shades of light, medium, and dark when you take a picture of it in black and white? That's a great way to check it. And having that will make your quilt interesting and give it shine and give it sparkle. So the other thing that we look for with a 5-yard quilt kit, especially ones that we're kitting here in the shop because we don't know what pattern you're going to use it for, we try to make sure that there's good contrast between all the pieces and all the other pieces. So keep that in mind too. If you're grabbing 5 yards of fabric at a shop and you haven't picked your pattern yet, it's hard to know what's going to touch what. And we really find with a lot of 5-yard quilt patterns, everything does touch everything else. So think about making sure that you've got good contrast in the fabrics that you're putting in your kit. So the last thing is to consider the scale of the fabric pieces that you're using. There are some great 5-yard quilt patterns, and we're going to talk about those next, and some of them are great if you have a fairly large focal print, but some of them are not well suited for having a large focal print. So make sure you kind of know what the scale is of your fabrics that you're going to work with when you go to select your pattern. So I'm going to share with you guys today some of my favorite 5-yard quilt patterns. I have a couple designers that I love their 5-yard quilt patterns, and we're going to start here with the Quilt Factory patterns. Deb at the Quilt Factory has some wonderful 5-yard quilt patterns. Hers are very unique. They're all very different. They're not patterns that you look at and say, oh, that's a 5-yard quilt. They're all very unique, original designs, and she has some great ones. Now hers tend to be patterns where you do cut things up a little bit more, so not always the best for large scale fabrics. This one really needs you to have a couple different shades of cream or a light background that are fairly similar but slightly different for it. This one has 2 fabrics in the pinwheel black touching some of the lighter fabrics, but then you have a spot for one of those bigger prints, and it is used as a border and it doesn't actually touch all the other pieces. So those kinds of things will sometimes make a pattern a better or worse fit for the fabric that you have in your 5-yard quilt that you're trying to put together. But Deb has some great patterns. The other person who has some wonderful patterns is Tia. Quilt and Tia Quilt Works, and she has a whole series of patterns she calls her AOK patterns, and they are all 5-yard quilt patterns. Now, Eclipse is a great one if you have a large focal print. You've got a fun spot to highlight that. A lot of hers are good for that. Same thing with interlace and same thing with helix. You've got a spot to highlight a focal print. Trapped has things cut up a little bit more, but still some larger pieces. So the AOK patterns go together very quickly. And then the last person is one of our local designers, Joy at Joy and Stitches, and she has some wonderful patterns as well. Tipsy Boxes is a good one. Plaid Boxes is another one of my favorites. Patchwork. And most of these 5-yard quilts, I'm going to flip this one over because I want you guys to see the effect that changing the placement of your light, mediums, and darks will have on the quilt. So take a look at the front cover and then look at the options that she's showing you on the back. That's one thing I love about the Joy and Stitches patterns is she always on the back of her patterns shows you what it looks like if you change the locations of your light, mediums, and darks. And it's amazing how sometimes it looks like a different quilt. You look at it and at a first glance you don't even think it's the same quilt design. But she will always have that on the back of her patterns. And there is Do the Twist. Flip that one over, and again you can see how she's just same fabrics, but she's moved where she put them. So that is a fun thing about her projects, is she gets you thinking about your color placement. So other things to keep in mind when it comes to 5-yard quilt patterns. The majority of them, and I'm speaking in generalities here, but the majority of them are going to be throw size quilts. That's typically what you can get to with 5 yards of fabric. Might be a large wall hanging or a toss over the back of the couch kind of a quilt, but most of them are going to be throw sizes. And the other thing to keep in mind is the 5-yard quilt patterns, that 5 yards of fabric does not include fabric for your binding. So generally you're going to want to buy probably anywhere from 1/2 to 2/3 of a yard of additional fabric for binding. Sometimes you'll have leftovers with some of them and you could do a scrappy binding, but there's no guarantee on that. So do know that when they quote it as a 5-yard quilt pattern, that is 5 yards for the top. Binding is not normally ever coming out of those 5 yards. So keep that in mind when you're planning your 5-yard quilts. So that's what we have for you today. Thanks for joining us. We hope that it's inspired you to maybe pull some fabric out of your stash and put some fun 5-yard quilts together.